I wasn't in a good place that fall, and that's the plainest way to start it. I say that now as a steadier man, with sleep under him and a year and a half sober, but back then I came up to my dad's old high basin sheep lease, like a man reporting to a sentence. The lease sat above timberline meadows and basalt cuts where the wind had a habit of finding your collar no matter how tight you buttoned it. Folks around there called one narrow pass the Needle Gap, and if you worked animals long enough you learned that name was less poetry than warning. I drove up in a dented 3/4 ton with a stock trailer rattling behind me. My whole life reduced to feed ledgers, 2 duffels, and one old border collie named Midge asleep across the passenger bench like she still trusted my judgment more than I did. By the first week of October, frost was glazing the water tanks each morning before light, and the ridges would glow copper for maybe 10 minutes before cloud built over North Ridge. You could smell winter coming in that basin before any weather radio said a word. Iron and cedar and cold stone. The lease had been my father's for 23 seasons, give or take one drought year when he sold early and cursed late. He died in July from a stroke while mending a north fence line, boots still muddy when they called me, and I carried that image like a nail in my pocket. He was not a man who asked for help, and I hadn't been a son who made himself easy to call. We were both built narrow in the places that mattered. After the funeral, my sister asked if I'd take the basin through winter so we wouldn't lose the contract. I said yes, too fast. Like yes could fix the year. The DUI came 6 months earlier on County 8, 20 miles from home. Nothing cinematic about it. I drifted over centre line, kissed a snow berm, and got lit up by a deputy I'd gone to school with. No wreck, no injuries, no speech about second chances, just paperwork, and a look that said he remembered me from better years. My wife, Nora, moved out while my license was suspended. She didn't scream. She set 2 boxes by the mudroom door and said, "Brett, I'm not doing this version of you anymore." That sentence had more weight than anything loud could have carried. Our boy, Eli, was 12 and had his mother's patience, but not enough of it for what I'd been giving him. He quit answering my calls by August. He texted once in September. "I need some space, Dad." It was polite. That made it worse. Up on the lease, my world got small on purpose. I slept in the stock trailer because the old bunkhouse roof leaked on the west side, and I didn't trust myself yet with too much comfort. I liked hearing the U's at night and the creak of trailer springs when the wind changed. I liked being where work started the minute I opened my eyes. Coffee on a propane burner, check the barometer hanging by the door, pull on wool and canvas, and headlamp my way to the first count. 412 head to start the season. Every morning and every evening I counted and recounted until the numbers sat right in my chest. Fences, feed, mineral blocks, hoof checks, weather windows, things with edges, things you could measure. Midge took her post like she'd signed papers for it. She was 12, grey around the muzzle, left ear always halfway folded like she was listening to 2 worlds at once. I talked to her more than I talked to any person those first weeks. "You and me, old girl," I'd say, while we stood above the lower pasture watching the flock spread and tighten with the breeze. "One winter, keep them alive, keep me honest." She'd glance up, then back at the sheep, tail tapping once against my boot as if that was agreement enough. The basin itself was beautiful in a hard, practical way. South-facing slopes held colour longer, rust grass and rabbit brush gold, while the north bowls stayed shadowed and wet. Basalt outcrops cut through the meadows like broken teeth, dark and warm by day, slick by dusk. Cedar and subalpine fir gathered in pockets wherever the wind let them, and old game trails stitched the draws together in lines I could follow even in low light. There were mornings when the sky came in so clear it looked brittle, and evenings when cloud moved low and fast and erased half the ridge in 10 minutes. That country never begged to be admired. It demanded attention. I ran my life by pressure changes and feed counts because I didn't trust my feelings to tell me anything useful. If the barometer fell sharp, I moved the flock downslope. If wind held from the northwest through noon, I pre-positioned hay at the cedar bowl near Needle Gap. If lambs looked tucked and still before sundown, I checked for draft and damp. It sounds cold laid out like that, but there was mercy in procedure. Procedure didn't care what kind of father I'd been. Procedure didn't ask why my marriage gave out. Procedure just asked if I'd done the next right thing. Nights were the difficult part. You can outrun yourself in daylight with work, but after dark, when the trailer walls popped with cold and the radio crackled out of range, memory got loud. I'd lie in my bunk in socks and thermal shirt, hands behind my head, and see Eli at 8 years old showing me a knot he learned at summer camp. All concentration and missing front teeth. Then I'd see him at 12, standing by Nora's car with his backpack on, not angry, just closed. I told myself I had come up here to save Elise. That wasn't the whole truth. I had come up here because every road down below ran past places where I had disappointed someone. One Thursday, I drove into town for pellets and a replacement gate hinge. Town was hardly more than a feed store, gas pumps, a diner with good pie, and 2 stop signs that argued with each other. At Molten Feed, I loaded sacks while old Ray Dillard worked the register, glasses low on his nose. Ray had known my dad 40 years and treated weather like a second religion. He watched me wrestle the hinge into the truck bed and said, "Northridge cycle's going to come early. You staying full season?" I said, "That's the plan." He nodded once and slid my receipt over. "Then don't get brave at Needle Gap. That wind will make a liar out of maps." I gave him a dry smile and said, "I'm done being brave. I'm trying competent now." He barked a short laugh and pointed toward Midge, who was sitting by the door pretending not to beg for jerky. "Dog's got better sense than both of us. You listen to her." It was maybe 30 words exchanged, maybe less. But hearing another human voice that wasn't me felt like stepping into sunlight after a long shed of shade. Then I drove back up the grade and watched the basins swallow me again. That evening, my sister, Dana, called just as I was finishing second count. The signal up there was thin as thread. I had to stand on the trailer tongue with my arm raised like I was trying to hail aircraft. "You eating?" she asked without preface. Dana was 3 years older and had inherited the family talent for sounding kind and stern in the same breath. "Mostly coffee and bad decisions," I said. "Try soup and fewer bad decisions." I could hear her kids in the background and a TV turned low. Normal house noise. It hit me harder than I expected. She went quiet for a moment, then said, "How's sober going?" "Today it's going." "That's not nothing, Brett." I looked out at the sheep tucked in a loose crescent below the cedar line, little pale commas against dark ground. "I keep waiting to feel like I deserve any of this," I said. "The lease?" "Another chance." She didn't rush to fill the silence. "Deserve is a trap," she said finally. "Do the work in front of you. Keep doing it. Eli may not answer now, but he's watching what you do, whether he says so or not." The call dropped after that, as calls did, but the sentence stayed. 3 days later, the first hard storm warning came over radio at 4:10 p.m., clipped and calm like all dangerous information is. Northridge front. Fast accumulation. Wind advisory escalating to blizzard conditions by midnight. I'd already moved feed to the lower lee side and checked the east fence twice, but hearing the warning still put a knot under my ribs. Storms there didn't arrive like weather. They arrived like decisions already made. I made one more round before dark, boots punching through crust, headlamp throwing a tunnel through blowing granules of ice. Midge worked wide and patient, turning the flank of the flock with little body feints. No wasted motion. When the last ewe slipped through the gate and settled where I wanted them, I latched up and stood a moment with my gloved hands on cold steel. The wind carried that clean metallic smell. Snow gets right before it turns mean. Somewhere above us, timber creaked and answered itself. Back in the trailer, I hung my coat, wrote the head count in Dad's old green ledger, and set tomorrow's tasks in the margin, though I knew the storm would rewrite half of them. I stared at his handwriting on earlier pages, blocky and level, and then at mine, tighter and slanted, like I was bracing against something. I wanted to say I felt hopeful that night, or at least determined. Mostly, I felt tired in my bones and thin in my spirit, like one good shove could have folded me. But I was there. I was sober. The flock was fed and sheltered. Sometimes that was the whole prayer. Before I turned out the lantern, I scratched Midge behind her ear, and she leaned into my hand with a small groan of contentment. "One winter," I told her again. "That's all we're promising." Outside, the first real gust hit the trailer broadside and kept going, and I lay down fully dressed, listening to the basin gather itself around us. I lay there listening to the wind drag itself over the trailer roof like a heavy tarp pulled by unseen hands, each gust finding a seam and worrying it, each lull so brief it only made the next hit feel louder. Midge slept under the little fold-down table with her nose tucked to her tail, but every time the frame shuddered, her ear flicked, and one eye opened toward me, checking if I was still where she'd last seen me. I kept my boots on and my coat bunched beside me, not because I planned to go out in that dark unless I had to, but because being dressed felt like a small argument against helplessness. Around midnight, the temperature dropped hard enough to crack the thin ice in the wash bucket, and that sound, tiny and sharp, made the whole storm feel personal. There's a kind of loneliness that comes from being physically alone, and there's another kind that comes from knowing exactly who you'd call if you had the courage and choosing not to. That second kind sat heavier on me. I could have called nobody anyway with the signal gone, but I still held my phone in my hand for a while, screen dark, thumb hovering over Eli's name like maybe intent counted for something. I pictured him at Nora's place, probably asleep, probably not thinking about whether I'd tied down feed tarps or if the north panel gate would hold. I told myself that was good. A kid shouldn't have to worry about his father in a mountain storm. Then a meaner thought came behind it, quiet and precise. A kid also shouldn't have to worry whether his father's sober on a Tuesday. The wind hit broadside again, and I set the phone face down and breathed until the tight spot under my sternum eased. At 2:17 by my watch, I gave up on pretending I could rest and stepped outside with the headlamp on low. Snow came sideways, not falling so much as being thrown, each grain stinging whatever skin I'd left uncovered. The flock was where I'd bedded them, packed close in the lee pocket below the cedar line, backs powdered white, and heads down into one another. That sight should have settled me fully. It settled me halfway. I walked the perimeter anyway, counting by clusters, touching cold wire, listening for the wrong sounds, panic, separation, a gate banging loose. All I heard was wind and the occasional soft complaint from a ewe disturbed by drift on her flank. Midge moved with me, shoulder brushing my knee once, then trotted ahead to check the corner by the old basalt tooth where snow liked to curl. Nothing wrong there, nothing dramatic to fix. Just weather being weather, and me standing in it, feeling small. By dawn, the blizzard had spent its first anger and dropped into a steady, bitter blow. I made coffee that tasted like burnt pennies, thawed my gloves over the propane flame, and took first light count with numb fingers and a pencil that kept snapping at the tip. 412, every head present. I said the number out loud twice, not for bookkeeping, but for relief. Midge sneezed and looked offended that I was surprised. The basin wore a new shape after a storm like that. Drifts shouldered up against fence lines, old tracks erased, gullies filled smooth as if somebody had gone through with plaster. It was clean in a way that didn't feel pure so much as temporary. You could see where trouble would start again once the next front lined up. 3 days passed under a pale sky that never quite opened, and I fell into the usual post-storm grind. Break ice, shake frozen netting free, check hooves, drag hay where drifts hadn't locked the sled runners. The work kept my hands occupied and my mind from circling the same regrets too tightly. But evenings still widened in a way I couldn't outrun. I read old notes in Dad's ledger, mostly feed conversions and blunt remarks about wind direction, and once I found a line in his block handwriting that simply said, "Never trust the gap after noon in January." No explanation, no story, just instruction. I traced that sentence with my thumb like it might pass along some inherited steadiness I hadn't earned. On the fourth afternoon, the barometer had only dipped a little, not enough to trigger urgency, and radio traffic was quiet except for a road crew down low, talking about chains. I was mending the broken slat on the west gate when I noticed the silence first. Not empty silence, but organized silence, as if the basin had paused and was listening in one direction together. Chickadees that usually worked the cedar fringe were absent, no magpies arguing over nothing. Even the usual creak from the dead fir snag above camp had stopped, though the wind still moved. Midge stood with one forepaw lifted, head high, nostrils working. Then she did something she didn't do unless stock was settled, and she approved of circumstances. She sat down. Tail thumped once against the crusted snow. I checked my watch, looked at the sky, and swore under my breath because the flock should have been spread across the lower bench grazing the exposed tufts before dusk. Instead, when I crested the little rise above the cedar bowl, they were already bunched tight in the shelter pocket I used for fast weather pushes, all of them oriented the same way, calm as if they'd been put there by routine. No milling, no flank spill toward the open drawer, none of the anxious sidestepping I'd expect if they had moved in a hurry. They were just there, heads down, chewing, occasionally bumping shoulders in that absent-minded way sheep do when they trust the ground under them. I stood with my hands on my hips and felt the back of my neck go warm under the cold. The gate I'd planned to reinforce sat ajar, and beside it was a neat stack of juniper limbs, laid lengthwise against the lee side where drift usually tunneled through and made lambs bolt. Not random windfall. Freshly snapped ends, needles still green, pieces sorted by thickness like somebody had thought through airflow and panic points. I walked over and nudged one with my boot. Solid, useful, exactly where I would have put them if I'd had an extra hour and 3 more hands. I said to Midge, "You taking up carpentry now?" She looked at me, yawned once, and went back to watching the flock like that answer covered the matter. I started for the windward edge to see how they'd come in, and that's where I found the tracks. Large didn't cover it. Each print was longer than my forearm from wrist to elbow, pressed deep enough to hold a clean rim despite crust. 5 toe marks clear where drift hadn't scuffed them. The stride paced parallel to the flock's exposed side, not through the middle of them, and every few steps the track angled outward, as if whatever made it had widened its path to give nervous animals space before easing back in. I crouched there long enough for my knees to ache, trying to fit what I saw into categories that obeyed ordinary rules. Elk overlap, no hoof marks, melt and freeze distortion, the edges were too crisp, prank, Not at this altitude, not in weather, not with that weight in the snow. I pulled my phone, took 6 photos, then set my tape from the gatepost and wrote the measurements in the margin of Dad's ledger under today's date. If I was fooling myself, I wanted a record of how exactly. As I stood, a gust came through the gap and carried the smell of cedar sap, wet wool, and something else. Animal, musky, not foul, just present. Midge trotted over to one of the prints, sniffed it once, and instead of bristling or circling, she lowered herself into a sphinx pose beside it, calm as porch weather. That unsettled me more than the size. Midge had spent 12 years sorting danger from nuisance faster than any person I knew. If she was relaxed, she knew something I didn't. I heard myself mutter, half to her and half to the snow. I actually tipped my hat to footprints bigger than a dinner plate. The line sounded foolish out loud, and still, I touched the bill of my cap toward the tree line before I could talk myself out of it. That evening, the weather radio finally caught up with what the basin already seemed to know. Advisory upgraded, fast front, high winds after dark. I didn't have to run the usual hard push because the flock was where they needed to be before I gave the order. I spent the extra hour shoring the juniper stack and setting 2 more hay bales inside the bowl, moving with that odd mix of gratitude and suspicion you feel when help arrives from a direction you can't name. In the trailer, I spread the phone photos on the cracked screen and zoomed until pixels broke, looking for anything that would let me dismiss it cleanly. I couldn't. I told myself, this can't be real. If it is real, why isn't it hiding? If it isn't hiding, why does it feel like it's giving me room? I said it 3 times, like repetition might make one part false and therefore manageable. By the 2nd week of October, I had started checking that windward edge every shift, not because I believed anything in particular, but because the pattern was now part of the job whether I liked it or not. The next morning, after the front passed and the flock shook snow from their backs like old men shrugging off bad news, I walked the perimeter again. The big tracks were partly filled in, but still visible where they'd paced the exposed line and doubled once near the gate with the broken slat. At the mouth of the narrow trail into the cedar bowl, 2 smooth stones sat cross-laid on bare ground where the wind had scoured to dirt. I knew every rock on that approach well enough to notice new ones. These hadn't been there the day before. I picked them up, felt their warmthless weight in my palm, and set them back exactly as I found them, then stood there longer than I meant to, listening to a basin gone quiet again for reasons I couldn't yet explain. I stayed at that trail mouth until my fingers went stiff inside my gloves, looking at those 2 crossed stones like they were punctuation in a language I almost recognized. Nothing in me wanted to call it a sign. Signs were for church marquees and highway exits, not for a sheep lease half buried under October snow. But I had spent my whole adult life reading ground for meaning. Hoof angle, scat freshness, drift lip, wire strain. Ground told the truth when people didn't, and that morning the ground kept saying the same thing in 3 different dialects. Something large had walked the windward line. Something deliberate had improved my weak points before weather hit. Something had left markers where no marker was needed unless it was meant for me. Midge stood beside me, leaning enough to warm my knee, and I realized I hadn't thought about Nora or Eli for almost 20 straight minutes. That startled me more than the tracks. Grief had become such a constant hum. I only noticed it when it briefly cut out. I carried one of Dad's survey flags in my coat pocket for busted fence locations, and I used it then, pushing the orange tab into the dirt near the crossed stones so I could check whether wind moved them or anything touched them by nightfall. It felt half practical and half ridiculous, which had become a familiar split. Back at the trailer, I copied fresh notes into the green ledger. Stone marker at trail mouth, 2 smooth river rocks, cross pattern unchanged at 0735. Tracks on windward side, average length 19 3/4 inches wear, clean. Midge, calm. I underlined that last part. By noon, cloud had thinned to a bright haze, and the basin looked less haunted, more ordinary, which should have settled me. It didn't. Curiosity had got in. It wasn't loud and it wasn't brave. It was steady. By the next dawn, I was up an hour earlier than my usual first count, coffee in a thermos, posted on a basalt knob above the cedar bowl to watch what happened before I arrived. Cold, before sunrise has layers in that country. First, there's the sharp bite on your nose and knuckles. Then there's the deep, dry cold sitting in the rocks themselves, rising through your boot soles. Then there's the wind, which makes all of it personal. I watched the flock in that grey half-light, where sheep are more shape than colour, little moving mounds with steam lifting off their backs. Midge lay prone at my left, chin on paws, eyes open and bright. We stayed there through first light and into full morning, and nothing unusual happened except my own disappointment at that fact. Around 8, I climbed down and walked my perimeter. 50 yards upslope from the broken slat gate, I found a fir deadfall that had blocked the narrow side trail all month. It was no longer across the trail. It had been dragged clear and set parallel to the path, ends tucked under brush so it wouldn't roll back. No chew marks, no saw cut, no fresh machine tracks. Just moved, cleanly, usefully. Whoever had done it understood that sheep hate bottlenecks, especially in wind. 3 mornings in a row, I found one change like that. On the first, the deadfall moved. On the second, a shallow trough pressed through powder on the safe side of a drift-prone swale, just wide enough for sheep to string through single file instead of bunching at the lip. On the third, 6 flat stones were set edgewise along a muddy patch at the lower crossing, making a stepping line exactly where I usually lost a boot, and cursed my own planning. None of it looked decorative. None of it looked random. It looked like chores done by someone who respected momentum and ankles. I laughed out loud once, short and almost embarrassed, because I was standing there admiring trail work from a helper I couldn't identify. And if anyone had told me in August that would be my life in October, I'd have asked what they were drinking and where they hid the bottle. By the middle of that week, I started checking the barometer less for forecast and more for correlation. If pressure fell quickly, I expected to find a fresh adjustment by dusk. Twice I did. Once, near the lee side of the half-broken gate, a wedge of juniper had been woven between 2 rails to stop rattle. Another time, 2 old mineral tubs I'd left upside down were righted and set to block a narrow panic lane near basalt, where lambs tended to jam. I didn't see it done. I only saw the after, and the after made my day easier, safer, cleaner. There was no swagger in it, no spectacle. Just competent help arriving before need turned urgent. The resulting tension in me was non-trivial. I wanted to be grateful, and I wanted to reject what that gratitude implied. Evidence suggests both instincts can live in the same chest and take turns steering. I had to run into town for lamb milk replacer and a box of ear tags, and I told myself I'd keep my mouth shut about tracks because I still preferred my doubts private. At Moulton Feed, Ray was helping a man in a faded canvas coat I recognized from county meetings. Owen Pike, older than my father had been, all tendon and quiet eyes. We stood by the pellet stack waiting on the forklift battery to decide whether to cooperate. Ray asked how the upper lease was handling wind, and I said, better than I deserve. Owen looked at me over his glasses and said, Northridge has got old helpers some years. You don't ask for names. You just quit pretending you did it alone. I snorted before I could stop myself. That so? He shrugged like he was commenting on tire pressure. Storms don't care what you believe. They care what you notice. That exchange sat between us, maybe a minute, maybe less, but it followed me all the way up the grade, needling places in me that preferred certainty. That night, Dana called when I was fixing a hinge by lantern light, and I answered on the second ring so the signal wouldn't wander off first. She asked about feed, weather, and whether I'd made my Tuesday meeting in town, the one I was supposed to call into if roads got bad. I said yes, which was true. Then before I could edit myself, I said, "You ever hear Dad talk about big tracks up here?" Silence, then a careful exhale. "Brett, are you sleeping?" "Mostly." "You're not drinking?" "No." Another pause. "Okay, then tell me what you saw." So I did, clipped and factual, like a field report. When I finished, she said, soft but plain, "I love you. I believe you believe what you saw. Keep writing it down. Keep doing routine. If this is weather stress, routine will hold you. If it's not, routine will still hold you." She didn't mock me, which I appreciated. She didn't agree either. After we hung up, I stood outside with the phone in my pocket and looked toward the cedar bowl, feeling both steadied and lonelier, the way you can when someone does their best for you from far away. 2 days later, Graupel started around mid-afternoon, tiny hard pellets that rattled on my jacket and bounced off basalt like spilled shot. The sky had that low, bright look that means you'll lose the ridgeline before evening. I was moving the flock off the upper bench in a loose arc, midge flanking wide, when the first bunching behaviour started on the lead ewes. Heads up, ears angled, feet deciding faster than I had asked them to. They weren't panicking. They were checking. Then, one by one, they chose the side route through the trough I had found that morning and started dropping towards cedar cover without my whistle. I let them because fighting good movement is how you create bad movement, and because a primary consideration in stock work is humility when the animals read weather sooner than you do. I was halfway down the slope when Midge stopped dead, not stiff, just still, and looked past me to the tree line above the windward edge. I followed her gaze and saw it. A broad, dark form between two firs where no form that size should have fit cleanly. For a beat, I thought it was a stump I'd never noticed. Then it shifted weight, and the entire shape separated from the trees. Tall doesn't explain it. Big doesn't explain it. It stood head and shoulders above the fence posts by 4 feet easy, fur dark with wet pellets. Arms long enough that its hands hung near its knees. If it had moved straight at the flock, I think every ewe on that slope would have blown apart downhill. It did the opposite. It stepped sideways, slow and angled, placing each foot with measured care on the outer edge of their path, like a man walking the aisle of a crowded church trying not to brush a single shoulder. A yearling ewe near the rear startled and skipped out from the bunch. The figure stopped immediately and lowered its posture a little. Not crouching, just making itself less direct. It waited. The ewes settled, tucked back to the group, and the figure resumed its lateral pace, always outside their bubble, always matching their speed. The multifaceted strangeness of that moment broke my thinking into pieces. I could measure distance. I could read body language. I could see intent in movement. Everything I knew about large, wild things said pressure and opportunity and force. This was restraint. This was spacing. This was shepherding. And I hated that word in my own head because it sounded like myth, and I was standing in Graupel with numb hands and a count book in my pocket, not in a story. I didn't move for several breaths. I remember each one because I counted them deliberately, the way I did in early sobriety when craving rose and I needed numbers to cross a minute. 1. The flock kept descending, no break. 2. Midge's tail touched the snow twice, slow, like a metronome. 3. The figure glanced toward me. I saw eyes then, amber brown in flat light, not bright, not reflective, just attentive. There was no charge in that look, no challenge. It was the kind of look an experienced hand gives a new one at a gate. I see you there. Do your part and I'll do mine. I had a ridiculous urge to nod, and then I did nod, because whatever framework this was, courtesy seemed like the right tool. I told myself this couldn't be real. If it was real, why wasn't it hidden? If it wasn't hidden, why was it giving me room to breathe? The question loop ran hard for about 10 seconds. Then the practical layer took over, because weather punishes hesitation no matter what else is occurring. I moved down slope on a diagonal to close a gap near the basalt tooth, whistled Midge once, and she peeled off to bring in 2 stragglers with that same old precision she had shown for a decade. Above us, the big figure kept pace until the last ewe crossed into cedar shelter, then stopped at the windward lip as if an invisible line had been reached. It turned its head toward the bowl, then back toward the trees, then looked once more at me, not asking, not warning, just marking that we were both present for the same task. Then it stepped backward into the firs, one careful placement at a time, and the stormlight folded around it until I could no longer separate fur from trunk and shadow. No crash through brush, no dramatic exit, just absence where presence had been. Grauple clicked on my hood. Sheep chewed behind me. Midge trotted back and sat, pressing her shoulder against my shin with complete confidence, and I stood there with my pulse thudding in my throat, trying to decide whether my world had widened or simply become honest about how wide it had always been. By full dark, the front was on us, and every head was sheltered before the first true gust hit Needle Gap. I kept moving anyway, because standing still in weather like that turns your thoughts against you. I checked the west latch, stomped snow away from the lower trough, and hauled 2 flakes of hay into the cedar bowl 1 armful at a time, breathing steam through my neck gaiter while pellets of ice rattled against my hood. Midge stayed close, but not underfoot, circling the flock's edge and glancing upslope every few seconds as if she expected someone else on shift. Each time she looked, I looked too. The wind had a low note in it that night, a deep humming through the gap that made the cedar trunks vibrate under my palm. My headlamp beam showed woolbacks and blown snow and little else. Anything past 20 yards turned to moving white. I had just dropped the second hayflake when Midge left my side and trotted to the windward lip, then sat down facing the storm. Not braced, not warning, waiting. I shut off my lamp so I could see better into the dark, and for a few seconds, all I had was outline and motion. The cedar tops bowing, snow streaming flat, the flock shifting as one body whenever a gust leaned hard. Then a shape separated from the weather on the ridgeline above us. He stood there broadside for maybe 3 breaths, dark fur feathered with ice, shoulders hunched into the wind, one hand resting on a bent fir sapling like it was a walking stick, cut for a much larger country than mine. He was farther than before, maybe 40 yards, and still looked oversized against the trees. What changed me wasn't the height, it was the posture. He wasn't hiding from me and he wasn't advancing on me. He was holding that edge the way I would hold a gate when pressure built behind it. Not because he feared what was inside, but because what was inside needed calm. I felt my own shoulders drop without deciding to. I took 1 step out from the cedar cover into open wind, lifted my empty hands chest high where he could see them, and stood there like a fool in a whiteout, introducing myself to a figure no one in town would admit to seeing. He tilted his head once and shifted his stance, placing his feet wider as a gust came through. That was all. No bluff, no charge, no retreat. I don't know why that simple non-reaction landed so hard, but it did. It felt like being given room in a conversation I hadn't earned yet. I heard myself say, quiet and rough in my own ears, "I'm Brett." The storm swallowed the words at once. Midge walked out and sat between us with her tail curled around her paws, content as if we were three neighbours waiting on church doors to open. That almost made me laugh. I had spent years pretending control was the same thing as strength, and there I was, taking emotional cues from an old border collie who had no interest in my pride. The practical part of me kept taking notes, even while the rest of me went soft around the edges. Wind from northwest, temperature dropping, flock settled, large figure maintaining position on windward line. But another part had started to speak up in plain language. He could have stayed in timber and watched unseen. He did not. He could have crowded me off that slope by size alone. He did not. Whatever this was, it wasn't built around fear. An hour later, near midnight, I made another pass with a lantern instead of the headlamp because the warmer light bothered the sheep less. At the mouth of the narrow trail where drift always built first, I found fresh cedar boughs laid in a low fan across the opening, pinned with stones against lift. I hadn't put them there. They were set too high and too fast for wind to have arranged, and the angle made perfect sense. Break the first blast. Keep powder from loading knee-deep in one shot. I touched one branch, and resin stuck to my glove, sharp and clean. When I looked up, he was still on the ridge, farther back now, only shoulders and head visible between two trunks. He watched me inspect the boughs, then he looked toward the flock, then back at me. It was almost procedural. Your side, my side, same work. By dawn, the storm had spent down to a hard breeze and grey light. The basin looked planed flat, every old track erased except the deep lane on the windward edge where he had paced through the night. I followed that lane 50 yards uphill, stopping where his prints turned and came back in wide arcs that matched the flock's outer boundary. He had worn a path where drifting would have erased weak spots first. Not random wandering, patrol. I stood in one print, my boot disappearing in the centre with room to spare, and felt that old disbelief tug once more at the back of my mind. The numbers were wrong for anything I knew. The behaviour was right for everything I valued. By the next afternoon, I drove to Molten Feed for diesel additive and salt blocks. I kept replaying the ridge scene while the truck heater clicked and the wipers squeaked over blown melt. And by the time I hit town, I had almost convinced myself to stay quiet again. Then Ray asked, "How bad did North Ridge hit you?" And I said, "Bad enough to be grateful for help I didn't schedule." He squinted over the register. "Neighbour?" I shook my head and gave a half smile that felt brittle. "Not exactly." Owen Pike was by the coffee urn, and he said, without turning around, "You learn who your neighbours are by winter, not by fence line." Nobody laughed. Ray slid my receipt across and tapped it once. "Keep your counts tight," he said. "Whatever else is going on, do that." I told him I would, and I meant it. 3 days later, the forecast shifted from ordinary ugly to dangerous. Dispatch on the ranch band called for a fast, deep low with sustained crosswind through Needle Gap and heavy loading on the north faces by nightfall. I spent the morning staging hay and checking the ridge shelter above the basalt draw, the one with a half-collapsed west wall I hadn't had daylight enough to rebuild right. By noon, the sky lowered and turned the colour of dull tin. The ewes got restless in that pre-storm way, heads up, moving in short, uncertain starts. Midge worked beautifully, but she favoured her back right paw after stepping on old wire near the gate. Just a slight hitch that made my chest tighten. I sat in the snow, cleaned the pad, and wrapped it with vet tape while she licked my sleeve and pretended she had no pain at all. "Don't be brave," I muttered to her, echoing Ray without meaning to. "Be smart." I got most of the flock moving towards cedar cover by mid-afternoon, but a knot of about 30 broke uphill toward the ridge shelter when the first hard gust hit. Pregnant ewes hate pressure and will choose bad ground if panic gets a vote. I went after them with Midge limping but game, and by the time I reached the shelter my lungs were burning, and Spindrift had turned the world to a white tunnel. The west wall had slumped farther, dropping a lattice of poles and frozen brush across the entrance. 3 ewes milled in front of it, blocked and agitated, while the others pushed from behind. If that jam held, they'd pile and scatter in opposite directions once the wind rose another notch. I planted my shoulder into one pole, and it didn't move. Too much weight, wrong angle, one man short. Then the wind changed tone, not louder, just redirected, as if something broad had stepped into it behind me. I looked over my shoulder, and he was there at the edge of visibility, 10 yards off, snow streaking across his chest and arms. He did not come straight in. He waited until I backed 2 steps clear of the choke point, then moved to the fallen poles and lifted one end with both hands. The pole rose cleanly, brush shaking loose. He set it aside without throwing it, turned, and took the next. I grabbed the opposite end, and together we stripped the pile from the entrance in 4 quick motions, neither of us close enough to touch, both of us moving like we had practiced, though we hadn't. A ewe balked at the opening, sides heaving, eyes rolling white. He lowered to one knee, angled his body away from her line of sight, and extended one hand flat to the snow, palm down, still as stone. No grab, no reach, just a calm block that nudged her decision without forcing it. She stepped past him into shelter, then the next followed, and the line started to flow. Midge, brave fool that she was, took her place on the outside flank with her wrapped paw and kept the rear from spilling. He noticed the hitch in her step before I did, because after the last ewe cleared the gap, he disappeared 1 second into the blowing white and came back the next, carrying a strip of dry cedar bark. He set it by my boot and stepped away. I stared at it, then at him, and understood. Cushion. I dropped to one knee, unwound the wet tape from Midge's paw, padded the cut with cedar bark, and rewrapped. She tested it, put weight down, and looked up at me like I had finally caught up to obvious information. I laughed once, breathless and shaky. "You're getting outworked by everybody, Brett," I said, and for the first time in a long while the joke didn't taste bitter. When I rose, he was standing 3 yards farther back, giving space for me to settle my dog and my pride in private. The wind climbed toward evening, but the jam had broken, and the 30 head were now tucked behind basalt and cedar where they could ride it out. I checked count twice, then a third time because gratitude made me suspicious of good luck. Every number held. I turned toward him with my glove off despite the cold, hand open at my side so it wouldn't look like a reach. "Thank you," I said, and my voice cracked on the second word. For her. For all of it. He watched me a long moment, amber-brown eyes steady and unreadable in the snow haze, then dipped his head once. Not theatrical, just acknowledgement. He stepped back to the windward rim and took position where the drift first curled, broad shoulders turned to the gusts, a living wall that never asked to be named one. I spent the next hour cycling between flock clusters with Midge at my heel, each pass bringing me by that ridgeline where he stood and adjusted, and stood again whenever the wind shifted. This was no longer ambiguity, no pattern I could call coincidence if I wanted to sleep easier. It was deliberate care, expressed in work. By full dark, we had every ewe bedded in the best shelter available, the broken wall braced with salvaged poles, and one old dog walking soundly on a cedar-padded wrap I had not thought to make. When I looked up from the final latch check, he was already moving toward timber, each step quiet and placed, fading into fur shadow as the storm closed around the basin and held. I stood in that last glimpse of him until snow skated over his tracks and the firs took back their shape. Then I turned to the work because weather does not pause for awe. I made another pass along the cedar bowl, lantern low, counting noses by ear tag and shoulder scar, and the way certain old ewes carried their heads when they were tired. Midge kept close, her wrapped paw holding better than I expected, and each time she looked at me, I got the same clear message. Keep moving, keep counting, keep this simple. By the time I hit the trailer again, the wind was strong enough to make the door groan against its latch. I wrote the tally in Dad's green ledger with a stiff hand and stopped with the pencil point hovering. 382 in main shelter. I checked my arithmetic twice, 30 missing. For a full minute I sat there with the ledger open and listened to my own pulse. In the thin trailer, quiet between gusts. 30 was not a rounding error. 30 was a break in the line, a bad turn somewhere upslope, a pocket I had failed to lock down while I was busy being grateful for help. I put on dry gloves, switched to the heavier coat, and took the spare lantern because the first one was already fading. "We're going," I told Midge. She was up before I finished the sentence. When I stepped out, the wind hit hard enough to shove me half a pace sideways, snow cutting across my face like thrown grit. By midnight, Needle Gap was a white wall with no horizon, only grade and guesswork, and the old memory of where the trail should be under the drift. I moved by landmarks I could feel more than see, the basalt tooth at my left knee line, the split cedar stump near the switchback, the low dip where meltwater ran in spring. Midge ranged ahead in short arcs, then came back to my boot when visibility collapsed, never pulling, just checking. Halfway to the saddle, I found the first sign I wasn't chasing ghosts. Sheep tracks, fresh and tight, driven by pressure but not full panic, heading toward the lee side above the draw instead of scattering into open slope. Along the outside edge, deeper prints ran parallel in a broad stride, then cut wide where the sheep path narrowed at the choke point. Same pattern as before, same deliberate spacing. I touched one print with my glove and felt that jolt of recognition and disbelief wrestling in my chest all over again. Then I heard it, not a call, not a cry, just the dull, packed sound of bodies shifting close together somewhere ahead. The saddle opened in front of me all at once when a gust cleared the snow for 2 breaths. The overhang sat dark in the basalt like a half-closed hand. In front of it, 30 head crowded shoulder to shoulder, heads down, turned away from the wind. And on the windward side, he stood with his back to the storm, broad enough that the blast split around him instead of through them. He would brace, ease one step, angle his body, and a ewe at the edge would find the opening and move into deeper shelter. No hurry, no forcing, just sequence and patience. A weak lamb lay near the outer rim, legs folded wrong under it, too spent to rejoin the push. He looked at me once, then at the lamb. Then he bent, lifted it with both hands like it weighed nothing and still might bruise, and set it beside the coat I had dropped on a rock to free my arms. Then he stepped back 3 paces and turned his shoulders away so I could kneel without crowd. Something gave way in me, right there, quick and clean, like a knot pulled loose after months of strain. I knelt in snow to my shins, gathered that lamb against my chest, and started crying so hard I had to put my forehead on its wool to breathe. Relief was part of it, and shame was part of it, and gratitude was part of it. But there was another piece deeper than all 3. I had spent a year believing my failures were final, and here was this huge, quiet being in a blizzard, showing me, one careful motion at a time, that care could still be offered where I had made a mess. I remember thinking in a hard, clear stream, I am here. I am sober. I am not hiding. I am being helped, and I do not get to pretend I am alone anymore. The words came one after another like fence posts I could finally see through blowing snow. I said out loud, voice raw and shaking, "Thank you. I know how that sounds, but thank you." Midge lay down between us with her chin on her paws, as calm as a dog on a kitchen rug, and that small, ordinary sight almost made me laugh through the tears. I had 1,000-pound storm on my back trail, 30 sheep to settle, and I had apparently become the kind of man who said "excuse me" while sidestepping an 8-foot neighbor at a crowded doorway. If Eli had seen it, he'd have rolled his eyes and then asked 12 practical questions. The thought steadied me. I wrapped the lamb inside my coat, tucked it under the overhang behind 2 older ewes, then stood and pointed to the outer flank where 3 yearlings were still taking wind. He watched my hand, shifted left, and blocked the gust line. I moved right, clapped once, low and sharp. The yearlings tucked in. For the next stretch of night, we worked in parallel like that, each of us taking the side. The other wasn't on. When a drift slumped near the trail mouth, he shouldered the loose slab away from the entry while I kept the nearest ewes from surging. When 2 lambing mothers balked at the dark of the overhang, he lowered his posture and looked away, and I slid in from behind with Midge nipping air at their hocks, just enough to start them forward. No touching, no theatrics, no grand moment that would make sense to people who needed one clean explanation. Just labor shared under ugly weather. Once, while we reset a brush screen against the lip, my hand ended up on the same basalt shelf where his knuckles had just been. The stone was warm from him despite the cold. Around 2 in the morning, the wind shifted a quarter turn west, which usually made that saddle unusable. Instead, the overhang held. He moved to the new blast angle before I pointed, and I realized he had been reading the gusts 1 beat ahead of me all night. We got the last of the stragglers in by then, including a ewe I recognized by a torn left ear and stubborn gait from 3 seasons ago. I checked count by headlamp and lantern together because 1 light alone kept washing out tag numbers. 30 present. 2 newborns tucked against their mothers. The weak lamb by my coat had found enough strength to lift its head and complain, which was the best sound I'd heard in months. I wrote the number on my glove with a marker so I could not talk myself out of believing it later. The storm ran another hour hard, then began to lose structure, gusts coming farther apart with thin stretches of near quiet between. In one of those lulls, I poured hot water from my thermos into the cap and set it on a flat rock a few feet from where he stood. He looked at it, then at me, then left it untouched. Not refusal exactly, more like boundaries stated gently. I nodded once and drank it myself, the water tasting faintly of coffee and wool and relief. He turned back into the wind as it rose again, and I took my place at the overhang mouth with Midge pressed to my boot, listening to sheep breathe in the dark. Dawn came grey and slow, the way it does after a night that asked too much. The cloud ceiling lifted just enough to show fir tops and the long white shoulder below Needle Gap. I stepped out to stretch my back and found him 10 yards upslope, no longer braced, simply standing with both arms loose at his sides, watching the flock settle in morning light. His fur was rimmed with ice along the shoulders. One forearm carried a fresh scrape where basalt had kissed skin while he moved drift, shallow and already clotted with snow. He looked tired, not hurt, just spent in the same honest way I felt spent. I placed my hand over my chest and dipped my head. "They're all here," I said, "because of you." He held my gaze for a long moment that felt private and complete. Then he stepped back once, twice, turned toward the timber, and walked uphill with that same measured care he had shown all season, choosing placements that did not kick loose snow onto the trail we would use later. At the mouth of the path, he paused beside two smooth stones half buried in crust. With one huge hand, he set them cross-laid on bare, wind-scoured ground, exactly where I would see them when I brought the flock down. He rested his fingers there a beat, rose, and continued into the firs. No look over the shoulder, no demand to be followed. The trees took him in 10 steps. That was all. I waited until the ridge was empty, then I crouched by those stones and put my palm flat on the cold space between them. Midge came and leaned against me, steady weight, warm flank, patient as old faith. Behind us, under basalt and cedar, 30 sheep and 2 newborn lambs breathed in unison, while the last loose snow hissed across the saddle, and the storm, finally, let us keep what we had carried through the night. I stayed crouched there another minute, not because I was tired, but because I wanted that exact shape of morning to settle all the way into me. Midge warm against my side, sheep breathing behind a basalt, crossed stones under my palm, and a quiet I had not earned by force. Then I stood, brushed the snow from my knees, and went back to being a shepherd. I counted twice at the overhang and once more at the trail mouth as I started them downslope. 30 head. 2 newborns riding close to their mothers. The weak lamb tucked under my coat for the first stretch, then set down when it found its legs. By the time the sun pushed through thin cloud, I had the whole bunch moving toward the cedar bowl in a slow, steady ribbon. At the windward edge, I stopped where his deepest prints circled and pulled my phone with stiff fingers. I took photos from 3 angles, then laid my tape measure across 1 clean track and took 2 more with the numbers visible. I did the same at the narrow choke point where the stride widened to give the sheep room. When I reached the trail mouth, I photographed the crossed stones exactly as placed and then left them where they were. That part mattered to me. Evidence, yes. Possession, no. Back at the trailer, I hung my coat to Thor, set the weak lamb in a straw crate by the heater for 20 minutes, and opened Dad's ledger to a fresh page. I wrote every detail while it was sharp. Time, wind shift, count deficit, overhang location, his position as windbreak, lamb transfer, drift clearing, cedar bark paw pad, final count recovered. I copied the marker number from my glove into the margin so there'd be no argument later, with my own memory. Then I took the orange survey flag from my pocket and set it on the table. I had used it at the crossed stones and forgotten it in the dark. I drove it into the dirt by the trailer door instead, a plain marker that said, this was no longer a thing I was trying to trap or prove. It was something I was honoring by doing my job well. The signal came and went all morning, but just after lunch, I got 1 bar on the trailer tongue and called Dana. She answered on the second ring, voice tight before she even said hello. Brett? I'm here. You sound worn out. What happened? I gave it to her straight, same way I wrote it. 30 missing. Saddle overhang, all accounted for by dawn. No losses. I told her about the lamb, about Midge's paw, about the crossed stones reset at daybreak. I did not dramatize it, because there was no need. When I finished, she was quiet long enough I checked the screen to make sure the call had not dropped. Then she said, I don't know what category to put this in, and I'm done pretending I need one before I listen. I sat down on the trailer step and watched steam lift from the crate where the lamb had settled. That helps, I said. I called Nora last week, Dana said. I didn't tell her you were seeing things. I told her you were doing the work in front of you. I can call again if you want, and tell her this morning you saved every head in a blizzard. Tell her the truth, I said. Tell her I had help. I will. And Brett? Yeah. Keep the ledger pages, back up your photos tonight. Whether anybody believes this or not, you protect your own record. By that evening, I had done exactly that. I sat at the little dinette with the lantern hissing low and copied the track photos to a thumb drive I kept, with registration papers and vaccination logs. I printed contact sheets at the feed store printer 2 days later and wrote notes on the back: date, location, scale reference, weather conditions. I put one set in a manila envelope labelled Dana Tucker, one in a plastic sleeve inside Dad's ledger, and I started a third addressed to the State Wildlife Office. I held that envelope a long time at the post office counter, then stepped out of line and tore it in half in the parking lot. Not out of fear, out of clarity. I did not need a file number attached to him. In my ledger, I noted, plainly, formal submission abandoned by choice. 3 days after the storm, roads opened enough for a supply run, and I walked into Molten Feed with sleep still stuck in my shoulders. Ray looked up from the register and did a double take at my expression. "You look like a man who saw all his bills paid at once," he said. "Close," I told him. 0 storm losses. That got Owen Pike to turn from the coffee urn. He studied me a long moment, then nodded toward the back pallet stack where it was quieter. We stood there between salt blocks and mineral tubs, while Ray pretended not to listen. Owen said, "Your dad saw him once. Winter of 2009. Never told town. Told me because I asked why his north numbers were always better than ours." I felt my throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with cold. What did he say? Almost nothing. Said, "If you get help up there, don't make it ugly by bragging." Owen shrugged. He gave me that look like I was slow and added, "Do your part and keep your mouth clean." Ray finally joined us and leaned one elbow on the pallet. "That why he'd leave 2 apples on that back rail every first snow?" he asked Owen. Owen gave him a sideways glance. "You noticed?" Ray snorted. "I notice inventory and odd behavior." No one smiled wide. It wasn't that kind of moment. But something in me settled. The loaded look Owen had given me weeks earlier now had a name and a history. My father had carried this quietly, and for once the silence between us did not feel like distance. It felt like inheritance. By early November, the North Ridge cycle threw 2 more fast storms at us. In both, the flock bunched early without hard pressure. In both, I found fresh windward pacing and small practical adjustments near weak points. One moved branch pile, one shallow trough set where drift would have trapped lambs. I photographed each sign with a tape reference, logged each in the ledger, and left each in place. The pattern held through lambing. At the season close, I sent the lease report to dispatch and to the county co-op with final numbers and one line in the remarks field. 0 blizzard losses. Shelter strategy revised to cedar bowl and basalt overhang rotation. Dispatch called back 2 days later, mostly to confirm count totals. 0, the woman on the radio said. In that cycle? 0, I answered. Well, she said, papers rustling. Whatever you changed, keep it. I did not add anything. Outcome noted. The harder call came in December, after I had rewritten it in my head 50 times. Nora answered with guarded politeness, and I could hear Eli in the background arguing with a game console. "I'm not calling to ask for anything big," I said. "I want to send him a letter, not a speech, just honest." She let out a breath. "Send it. I'll make sure he gets it." That night, I wrote at the trailer table until my hand cramped. I told him I had been selfish and unreliable. I told him sober was not a promise anymore, it was a daily practice. I told him I was learning that strength looked more like showing up than talking. I left out the big tracks and the amber eyes and the crossed stones because the letter was not the place to ask for belief. It was the place to offer truth. I mailed it the next morning with the Dana envelope receipt tucked inside my pocket like a talisman. Eli texted 6 days later while I was breaking ice at the lower trough. "Can we talk Sunday?" I sat on an upside-down bucket in the wind and stared at the screen until my vision blurred, then typed back, "Yes, anytime." Sunday, he asked direct questions, in a voice trying hard to sound older than 13. "How long sober? Do you go to meetings? Are you still mad all the time?" I answered each one clean. At the end he said, "Mom said you wrote me a real letter." I said, "I did." He was quiet a second, then, "Write another one next week." When the first real thaw came in March, Nora drove him up for a day visit at the lower homestead, well below the dangerous ridge. I had mended the porch step and cleaned the mudroom so it looked like a place where people could breathe. Eli climbed out in a growth spurt, longer arms, same careful eyes. We stood awkward for one beat, then he stepped in and hugged me hard enough to knock my hat askew. Midge circled us in offended delight. We spent the afternoon fixing a fence panel and setting mineral tubs side by side, passing tools more than words. Late light turned the wet meadow gold, and he said, without looking at me, "Mom says you stopped trying to be right and started trying to be steady." "Your mom's usually right," I said. He nodded. "Dana told me you had a weird winter." I drove a staple, tapped it flush, and chose the next sentence like it mattered. "I had help I can't explain cleanly. Help that taught me something." He finally looked up. "Like what?" "That I don't get points for doing hard things alone." He considered that, then gave a small grin. "That sounds like something a giant old dog would teach." I laughed, surprised and grateful. Close enough. In April, before we moved the flock off lease, I walked one last dawn loop to the trail mouth above the cedar bowl. Snow had pulled back into dirty ribs under the firs. The crossed stones were gone, either lifted by runoff or set elsewhere by hands I never saw. I stood there anyway, hat in my hand, and thanked him out loud once more. No tracks, no movement, no answer except wind through new needles and the soft clatter of sheep bells below. The mystery stayed intact. The kindness did too. I still keep Dad's ledger on the shelf by my kitchen table. The photo sleeve is there, the notes are there, and Dana has the duplicate envelope in her fire safe. The wildlife submission remains marked abandoned. Ray never asked for proof again. Owen never expanded past what he'd already said. Some people in town hear my zero loss report and credit luck, or timing, or a good dog. I agree with all three and leave it there. Midge made it through one more spring and is buried under a cedar above the lower pasture with her favourite blue collar looped on the marker post. Eli and I visit that spot when he comes up, and now he comes up often. We mend fence, check counts, drink bad coffee, and talk like men who are still learning each other but no longer afraid of the work. What changed was not that I solved anything grand. The crux was simpler and harder. I stopped treating my life like a courtroom and started treating it like a flock in weather. You watch carefully. You accept help when it comes. You keep moving what you can into shelter. That winter did not erase what I broke with Nora or what I missed with Eli, but it gave me a framework sturdy enough to rebuild with honesty instead of performance. The world I trusted used to be fences, feed and pressure trends. I still trust those. I just trust one more thing now, that there are forms of care bigger than your understanding. And if you meet them with respect, they can walk beside you long enough to get everyone home.